Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in for another webinar from the Newlines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, DC. My name is Azim Ibrahim, and I am a director here at the Newlines Institute. Today's event is brought to you by Newlines Institute, along with the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights in Canada. Do look them up. They're doing some stellar work on this front. Do check out their Twitter account and their website. For those of you who are familiar with our work, you'll know that we have been working on the Rohingya genocide issue for quite some time. We set up a group called the Rohingya Legal Forum a couple of years ago, and I've done a lot of innovative work around that area. We compiled a coalition of lawyers, experts, legal analysts who have done some excellent policy work on the Rohingya issue. And more recently, we've also done lots of work on the Uyghur issue through a group that we set up last year called the Uyghur Scholars Working Group. This is a project that we launched for scholars around the world who specialize in Uyghur studies, and so it allows them to exchange views, consider strategies, commission new research, all to expand our knowledge on how to best understand and approach this complicated situation of the Uyghurs. The goal is to deepen our understanding of the Uyghur situation and to develop more innovative policy solutions, which we can then present to policymakers here in the US and elsewhere around the globe. We have dozens of cutting-edge reports and research in the pipeline, so please do sign up for our Uyghur series reports, a link to which is available in our Twitter feed right now. So ladies and gentlemen, last year, our two centres, the Newlines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, decided to partner and collaborate to answer a fundamental question. Does the treatment of the Uyghurs by China meet the definition of a genocide? And to do this, we consulted over 50 of the top experts from around the globe, experts in international law, in genocide, in Chinese studies, in Uyghur history. And these were some people of the highest caliber, some of the highest caliber people you could think of: former attorney generals, former justice ministers, prosecutors from the ICC and ICJ, scholars of the highest caliber. And to do this, we looked at over 10,000 testimonials of Uyghur witnesses and accounts from detainees. And we corroborated all of this with the Chinese government's own directives, its own manuals and its own laws. And the conclusion was very clear, that China has breached every article of the Genocide Convention. And this is something that they cannot deny. But what was the purpose of this report? Why does it even matter? And what can we now expect from the international community once that a report like this has actually been published? And what kind of reaction can we expect from China? To answer some of these questions, we have put together a stellar panel for you today. Yonah Diamond is an international human rights lawyer at the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. He has co-authored and served on the steering committee of multiple reports, including Cameroon Unfolding Catastrophe. He's lectured at McGill University's Maxwell School of Public Policy and at the European Parliament. He's published very widely on human rights, international justice, peace and reconciliation, and he's also served as this project's principal author. Professor John Packer is very well known to most of our audience. He's done lots of events with us. He's probably done more events with Newlines than myself. He's a Nürnberger adjacent professor of international conflict resolution in the Faculty of Law and the Director of Human Rights Research and Education at the University of Ottawa. For over 20 years, he has worked for intergovernmental organizations from the UNHCR, the ILO, the OHCHR, UNDP, OSCE, and any other alphabet soup that you can conjure. John has worked for them. These include investigations on serious violations of human rights, notably in Iraq, Afghanistan, Burma, Myanmar. He's also the former senior legal advisor and the first director of the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And Professor Packer for this project served as the principal advisor. And then finally, we have Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who is the China reporter at Axios and one of the top China experts in Washington. She is the author of the weekly Axios China newsletter and works on high-impact investigations on Beijing's influence and intentions. Bethany is a graduate of Yale University and has spent many years in China. She speaks fluent Chinese, and I can say with the utmost confidence that if you have not subscribed to the Axios China newsletter, then there is a serious gap in your China knowledge. So please do look her up and follow her. But welcome to all our guests. And let me start off, first of all, with John. John, you have been involved with this project right from the outset, and you are an expert in this field. But let me first of all ask you, how does this report differ from all the other reports that have come before this? This is not the first report to come to this determination. We've had private law firms look at this. We've had other agencies. So how does this differ from all the other ones that have come before?
So thank you very much, Azim, for, first of all, the initiative and the invitation, and for really committing to this project. I think it differs in a number of important facets. First of all, what the report actually is a straightforward application of the Genocide Convention to the facts as they are available through public sources. And I would like to underline in that regard, we'll hear more about it, that there's actually an abundance of information. So it's not like this is something that we're really not sure about what's been going on. There's actually quite a long history, and there's quite a lot of specific relevant information available. To the extent that we can look at that information, what we've simply done is applied the basic treaty applicable to this kind of situation, which is the Genocide Convention of 1948, to which the People's Republic of China is a state party, having not only a signatory, but having reflected specifically upon its ratification, I believe in 1983. So there should be no doubt about what is the applicable international law. When all these discussions take place about what is it, what's going on, at least we should be quite clear what the applicable international law is. And then what we've done is we focused only on Article 2. The convention has 9 principal provisions, and we did not talk about, for example, complicity or other elements, and we did not focus on individual responsibility arising through, for example, international criminal law. We looked at only the treaty applicable to 152 states parties. China is only one of those. And we looked at the Article 2, which is the commission, the acts of commission. And we went one by one. And I would say that's a standard approach that's taught in kind of any law school. So it's not a mysterious approach, but it had not heretofore actually been done. So what is significant here is that we took upon ourselves to do that. And we did it not just as a couple of people with no particular background, but we collected experts across the spectrum of not only international law, but also, for example, area studies, sinologists, Uyghur specialists, and so forth and so on, so that we could have a good, sound understanding of the interplay between the facts and the law. And we did that in a public fashion. We did it pro bono, so nobody paid us. We didn't get any benefit from it. We did this for public good and public interest. And I think the report is fairly clear and speaks for itself.
No, thanks for that. Thanks for that, John. Yonah, let me take it to you now. You obviously you were the principal author of this report. I don't think anybody knows the material as well as yourself. And so, can you just take us through like the methodology that you used for this report? What was a particular unique approach that you had, and what were the main principal findings that led not just yourself, obviously everybody that was involved, to the unequivocal conclusion and determination that China has breached the 1948 Genocide Convention? Can you just walk us through that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Azim, and thanks, John. And it's an honor to meet and be on the same panel as Bethany. I want to thank you specifically, Bethany, for your contributions to journalism really of the highest order, with the China cables in particular, as pertains to this report. And as John mentioned, a key part of our methodology, and as I'm the principal author, this was actually a very collaborative international, as you mentioned, Azim, effort, where we've been consulting and getting contributions and reviewing the evidence for 6 months with those experts, as you mentioned, over 50 independent experts who have reviewed the evidence and saw our analysis and agree that that there is clear, convincing, and compelling evidence that China has breached every provision of Article 2. And these aren't, these are important, significant experts with judicial and investigative experience in these contexts, those who are most intimately involved with evidence gathering over the past few years, and those who have sat on international commissions over atrocity crimes. And so as to the evidentiary methodology, we looked at all of the collated and consolidated firsthand testimonies, Chinese government manuals, as some of Bethany's work has unearthed, planning documents, statements, statistical yearbooks, white papers, satellite imagery, reports, as well as expert analyses of all of this data. And the list of experts is growing by the day as well, those who agree with our conclusions. And so the focus on state responsibility is important because there is a common misconception that we see as to what genocide means. And the only definition we have is in the Genocide Convention, as John mentioned, and the only binding treaty on China in this case. And this was important in informing our approach as well, because China sits on the UN Security Council and does not recognize either the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. And so it's not only that there are certain impediments to international justice in these forums, but these are very serious impediments. And at the moment, we moved forward based on the available evidence. And so as the Genocide Convention lays out, genocide means, I think it's useful for the viewers, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a protected group as such. And so there are two major elements to the report. First, there is proving intent to destroy the group's existence as such. And we've showed that through objective measures, including the overall policy, law, destructive campaigns, and selective targeting of leaders. And all of these atrocities and policies really need to be viewed in the report and as a whole in order to see that the intent can be nothing other than destroying the group's existence, the Uyghurs as a group. And so the Chinese government's stated goals as to whether it's combating extremism, terrorism, separatism, etc., that is not how we measure intent on objective standards as to what's going on the ground. And so what we have shown is that, already by 2017, the entire group was terrorized and traumatized. And by now we are in the domain of working towards the elimination of the group's existence. And China is clearly targeting each aspect of the group's existence, working towards its complete destruction. And so the acts of genocide include killing members, large numbers of deaths within the camps already, and selective death sentences by execution or long-term sentences, particularly leaders, religious leaders and imams, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. We've shown this through the systematic forms of torture and sexual violence within the camps, psychological torture, etc., and deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction. So it's important for Article 2C to look at that these are extrajudicial facilities, and they're not necessarily prisons, right? It's actually way worse than prison conditions. And so these are conditions that are working towards the slow death of a group when one considers all of the deprivation of adequate food and torture methods and sleeping conditions and overcrowded conditions and prevention of ability to take a shower, etc. And these also must be seen in tandem with the forced labor conditions, schemes, and the systematic birth prevention campaign in the region, all contributing towards physical destruction, whether that's gradual or eventual. And so D is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and we've shown that through the systematic, well-documented birth prevention campaign in the region, including IUDs, abortions, sterilizations, and injections within the camps. While men of childbearing years and the, one of the most cited reasons for internment is related to birth policy. So we know that the birth prevention campaign is an integral part as well. And then E is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And again, we've seen the institutional transfer of Uyghur children to state-run Chinese language facilities with Han child rearing methods. So just a quick overview of what genocide is and what we've analyzed, and our conclusion, which is definitive in its terms.
Thanks so much for that comprehensive overview, Yonah. So Bethany, I want to ask you, as one of the foremost kind of China experts, this isn't the first report that's been, I won't say critical of China, but certainly exposing China's behavior. There's been multiple reports. We've worked on a few in the past with Adrian Zenz. We did the forced labor, Uyghur forced labor report, and there's been multiple other agencies engaged in this. And I think one of the key questions that everybody wants to know is that, what is motivating China to undergo, to execute policies of this kind? This is simply not doing them much good. A country that aspires to be a global influential power, and it's engaged in this kind of behavior, particularly as their own PR is actually quite poor in terms of explaining what's going on. So what's the key kind of motivational drivers, and why is that changed? Because this wasn't always the case. China has in the past historically has actually celebrated many of its ethnic minorities. They've seen diversity as one of their key kind of strengths. That look at our great civilization that included so many people of different backgrounds. Our previous leaders, Hu Jintao's, Jiang Zemin, and so on, were very keen on these ethnicities. So what has changed, and why is China actually engaged in this kind of behavior?
Sure, and also thanks, Azim, for moderating this event. And I'm so glad that your organization has put so much effort into one of the most important issues in the world right now. So the Chinese Communist Party has certainly a checkered history when it comes to its ethnic minorities. In the early 1950s, they were basing their ethnic minorities policy on a Soviet model, which is where you recognize each individual group and you give them some degree of autonomy. Now, they didn't go as far as the Soviet Union did in terms of coming up with actual separate republics, but there are several autonomous regions in China, autonomous municipalities and counties, and that was intended to allow recognized ethnic groups to have some more control over their own, particularly language and cultural policies. During the Cultural Revolution, though, between 1966 and 1976, you saw, a 180-degree turn where you could not be anything but Han, and you saw many people actually go and register and try to change their official national ID card to Han instead of whatever ethnic minority that they were. Then after the end of the Cultural Revolution in China's reform and opening up period, you saw a more of an embrace of diversity and a flowering of ethnic cultures and languages. And that certainly happened in Xinjiang. The 80s and early 90s were really a period of intellectual and cultural flowering for the Uyghur culture as they kind of rediscovered some of their long history, their own literary traditions. But what we've seen in the past, let's say 12 years or so, since 2009, when there were ethnic riots in Urumqi, and several hundred people died, I believe. Since then, and especially since around 2014, there has been an incredible tightening of ethnic policy. And it's not just in Xinjiang. We also see this in Tibet, even in Mongolia, and other ethnic groups, Hui Muslims in China. I'll point mainly, though, just to simplify things a little bit, to Xi Jinping's leadership of the CCP and his growing intolerance and the CCP's growing intolerance for any part of Chinese society that they cannot control and that they do not have direct visibility into at all times. Why Uyghurs themselves have been really the tip of the spear in terms of China's most egregious ethnic policies, and Tibetans, I would say, just about there as well, is because Uyghurs have a connection to an ethnic identity and a religious identity that, from the CCP's point of view, competes with their loyalty. So, the CCP, especially now, is incredibly distrustful of any competition for loyalty. And again, why Uyghurs have really faced so much of this is in part because of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East. And the rise of ISIS is really when you saw this get really bad. Now, to be clear, there were several hundred Uyghurs who did leave China and ended up with the Islamic State. So this isn't an entirely invented problem. But the Chinese Communist Party has taken what is truly a very small concern and has, turned it into they have reoriented almost their entire security, surveillance, and ethnic policy around the elimination of what they see as even a tiny threat. We also see, under Xi Jinping, an obsession with the elimination of any kind of dissent along the periphery. In terms of Hong Kong, there's been a total authoritarian takeover of Hong Kong. There seems to be a stronger move towards taking Taiwan back in Mongolia. So it's part of an overall hardline turn in China.
Excellent. No, thanks so much for that, Bethany. Yeah, and this is something I think Professor Sean Roberts articulates in his book as well, his most recent book, War on the Uyghurs, that much of this actually started with Xi Jinping himself when he visited Urumqi in 2014, and he was horrified to see that there was a distinct ethnic minority group who looked different features, had a different religion, a different language, they had a different history and different culture, and there was a process of signification which he wanted to enact throughout all of China. And obviously, as we know, it's not just the Uyghurs that are victims of this, other ethnic minority groups who don't get as much coverage, the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and so on. And Tibet obviously is one of the key case studies of this, and Shen Xuanguo, one of the key architects of these policies, has been at the forefront of this. But before I take it to John, I just want to say that I want to try to keep this as a discussion, so feel free to interject and ask questions to any of the other panelists or expand on their points whenever you feel like it. But one of the questions I think I want to ask John first, though, is that a question that I get very often, and now that this report has come out, is that so what? That it's fantastic you've done this report now, and but is this just an academic exercise that you have now made a point, or can this actually be used in the ICC or the ICJ? Are you able to prosecute anybody? Are you able to take any sort of action and use this as an evidential basis for anything substantive? And what can the international community actually do about this? So I think this is one of the most common questions I get from particularly people who are not in the domain of international law, who don't really understand even the difference between the ICC and the ICJ and what all of this actually means. So I think if you can just expand on that a little bit, John, I think that'll be very helpful.
Sure, Azim. Let me actually pick up a little bit from what one of the main points Bethany made. I spent a lot of my professional life dealing with, frankly, authoritarian dictatorships, essentially, and transitions from them. And even the nationalities principle, which goes back to Stalin's 1913 paper written about how to manage these kind of challenges, has to be seen through the lens of authoritarianism, even totalitarianism, this kind of absolutist, a dictatorial approach. There is only one truth. There's only one way to approach this. Even the ethnographers involved here, they will tell you how many ethnicities there are, and there are no more. There are only that number, and so forth. So now, what does this mean? How do we approach this in international relations? Our reference point to this is essentially international law. And the Chinese government keeps talking about sovereignty, and apparently even our conversation right now would constitute an interference in their internal affairs, according to their interpretation. That's just frankly nonsense. The international law limits the jurisdictions of states and prescribes them not only in terms of general international law, but very specifically in the Charter of the United Nations. So our reference point is the responsibility of states and the limitations on states. So when we look at a question like the conduct, the facts and the applicable law, we're applying international law between states. The Genocide Convention, what's very important here is that it is binding on China by the voluntary act of China. No one's imposed this on China. No one's invented this. China has accepted it. It is the reference point for them. But it's also binding on 151 other states. So just to take a step back here, the International Criminal Court you mentioned is established pursuant to the Rome Statute, which is another treaty, which is not binding on China. China has not accepted the jurisdiction of that court. So there is no prospect of a prosecution at the ICC, at least vis-a-vis China or with regard to actions in China. There may be with regard to other persons, that's another question. But as Yonah mentioned here, basically the idea of prosecution does not pertain. And prosecution is not possible between states. States do not prosecute other states. So we're in the domain of what's often called classical international law, the relations between states and their duties pursuant to treaties, essentially contracts. And now what that means is not only China has obligations to respect its undertakings, but if it is found to be doing things wrong, it has obligations to repair those. And the other 151 states have obligations, first of all, to call it out, because in this case, the treaty is one that literally prescribes prevention. So other 151 states should not only not be complicit, but they should actually be active in early, not late, early identifying potential breaches or steps in that direction. And then they should take steps to stop the genocide and certainly not to contribute to its perpetuation. There is the prospect through something called the universal jurisdiction that individuals within China who may be responsible personally for some of the breaches under international law, individual criminal acts, may be prosecuted if they happen to find themselves in another jurisdiction. I don't know, they go on holiday to Canada, my country, then Canada could arrest them and prosecute them under universal jurisdiction. But the likelihood of that is, first of all, slim, and second of all, will not address the actual problems that are ongoing. An individual prosecution will not result in stopping China's conduct in Western China, nor will it offer any opportunity of reparations. So I'll just stop there, but to say that it's maybe difficult for many people to grasp this, other than I would suggest we think about things like trade relations, how we get the clothes on our backs and so forth. This is all part of a global system of exchange and interaction, and it's all governed by international law between states.
Can I just follow that up, John? So what would be China is in clear breach of the Genocide Convention. So what are the actual consequences of that? You mentioned, obviously, state parties have to, the onus is on the state party. There's no court to actually, that you can take this case to and indict China in any shape or form. The obligation is on individual actual states or party to this. That makes perfect sense. But what are the actual consequences to China if no state actually decides to do this? And what does that actually say about the Genocide Convention? Are there any other provisions within it that come into effect? Another body, the UN, or any other extra kind of governmental institution that then kind of kicks in if nobody takes any action?
So a couple of things. First of all, the Genocide Convention itself is a treaty as such. And within the treaty, it explicitly provides that if one state considers another state to be in breach of some provision or of the spirit of it, because there's a good faith obligation to implement and respect the convention, including its preventive thrust. If that's the case, then states, as part of their shared obligation, this is what's called erga omnes obligation. It pertains to all states collectively, the community of international community as a whole, to uphold this convention. Then those states must declare that they essentially say, we think there's a breach. And what that entails is a couple of things. Under the treaty itself, under Article 9, normally a state would be bound to bring that to the International Court of Justice for an adjudication. But in this case, China has a reservation under Article 9 and says they will not subject themselves to a contentious case. So we can't do that. That's not a recourse. So what are the recourses? The recourses are just left to general international relations. Now that's normal. That's normal for all sorts of things, trade and all sorts of other. What states now can do, if they believe that there is a breach, then not only they can take steps themselves, for example, not to be part of this, for example, the trade, the forced labor products and so forth, but they are even permitted in international law to take steps that would otherwise constitute a possible breach. For example, interrupt a trade agreement that would not otherwise be permissible. You can do that in response. It's called a retortion. A permissible reprisal effectively must be proportionate, must be targeted, must be germane to the matter you're addressing. But then states not only can do that, but under the Genocide Convention, in my view, they should do it because they have this shared duty. Now, in addition to that, states may mobilize collectively, for example, at the United Nations or through multilateral like-minded organizations and so forth, to engage with China and proactively and say, what is going on here? China actually does not deny a lot of the activities, for example, the forced labor. What they then do is, on the one hand, they say they deny it out of hand. And then the next breath, they say, okay, yes, we do have some of these things, but we excuse them on the basis of counterterrorism, for example. Well, okay, let's have a discussion about counterterrorism. First of all, counterterrorism, there are no permissible excuses to genocide. So let's just be clear about that. But what are you doing for counterterrorism? Let's discuss that. But no, China's position so far is it's an internal affair. So we can't even discuss that. Well, then I think the international community now must collectively ask themselves, how important is this Genocide Convention? And I would put it to you, and I would put it to the viewers, that if we are ready to accept that a foundational, a cornerstone of the public international order post-Second World War, that a state may not just go after and eliminate part of its population, if that is not reliable, then I would ask, how reliable are intellectual property treaties? How reliable are arbitrary detention obligations under the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is also an obligation of China? I mean, I would say we're on a slippery slope to utter, the essential denial of the application of all international law. And China then becomes not only not a reliable party, but it becomes actually a problematic actor in general international relations.
That's a very good point, John. I think that's it's very clear. And I think this is an area a lot of people don't understand, is that the obligation is now on the states themselves, for every one of them who is a signatory and who's a member, who's a party to this convention, to actually undertake this action themselves. There is no extra judicial body that's going to come in and kind of make a determination, and states themselves have to determine and come to a conclusion in terms of how relevant is this treaty. And one of the things I want to ask Yonah, and this is an area obviously that all of us have experienced, and there's a lot of confusion, and we hear it and see it all the time, is that states, they try to confuse the issue, they try to obfuscate, they try to muddy the water, saying, oh, well, look, any genocide determination has to be made by the UN, has to be made by a court. We them ourselves cannot do that. But if I'm not mistaken, that's actually not correct. Every state has the ability to make a determination completely on their own, using their own apparatus. And, in the US, for example, it's done by the State Department. They have an entire, literally an army of lawyers to look at these kind of things. Many of them are very conservative in their approach, but under the previous administration, they did make a genocide determination on this particular issue. And in the current administration, they're going down the same kind of line. So can you just unpack that a little bit, Yonah, in terms of, states that continuously do this, and we continuously hear about this, even most recently, I think, from Canada as well, from your country. They're saying, well, it has to be some sort of high court determination. We have to wait for the ICJ or the Security Council or something of that nature. And that is really just obfuscation, isn't it? That's just really a delaying tactic when the political will is not there, particularly taking on a country like China, which, as Canada knows more than anybody, it's doesn't always work out very favorably and work out in your favor.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as John was saying, because it's not only that states can make this determination, there are literally at present no other avenues really to to make this determination. And so the responsibility really only falls on states. There's no route to a meaningful investigation and adjudication of the facts right now. And so therefore, yeah, Canada's parliament, the Dutch parliament, I know Italy's debating it now, and the US officially today, I believe, or yesterday in the State Department's human rights report, they officially recognized the genocide. And so this falls on states at the end of the day. And the internal mechanisms are often a little murky as to how they work, and they're not so transparent, but these mechanisms exist. And yeah, I mean, there's legal departments in every country, and our report, I would think, should be used as a pretty significant definitive analysis with experts not only from Canada or from the US or from the UK. So these are experts from every region that have been consulted and contributed. So in a way, this determination is more authoritative than an internal country if it's only focused on that country's department. And one thing that concerns me is, there are ways to hide behind no determination, by saying the evidence is insufficient, or there's always some sort of excuse. So if there are, forces within the government that are pulling it one way or another not to make this determination, I think governments can find a way to do that, to wiggle out of it. And so that's why it's really important to get things like this report out and to continue preserving and gathering the evidence, and continue seeking, unfettered and independent access through the UN and the Human Rights Council. But I'd be interested actually to hear from Bethany if how she feels, especially over the pandemic, how it's been difficult for reporters, and with the expulsion of English-speaking reporters, how has that affected like your work, for instance? I'd be interested to hear.
Could I just interrupt with two small points about your question, Azim, just for the viewers to be clear. So the Genocide Convention, and actually no human rights treaty, and actually almost no treaty I'm aware of, actually says that before a state may do anything, there must be a determination by some court somewhere. That's just not, that's fiction. There is no source of law anywhere that I'm aware of that says a state may not take on its own responsibilities unless and until some other body somewhere. I mean, that is the essence of sovereignty. A state is responsible within its own jurisdictional authority for its obligations. So this is one thing. But second of all, it would be madness, because the convention's object is to prevent genocides. If the idea is that the only time anyone may act is after some judicial determination of what? Some lower court in some country, some international body far removed from the situation without the powers of a state, that we have to wait until then? That means, first of all, it's not clear you will always get a credible determination, but second, or an accurate determination, but you will certainly always get a late determination. And that's completely contrary to the object and purpose of the treaty. So I think there's no doubt that this is, in literal terms, nonsensical. And it is simply a means of avoiding acting, because the implications of acting, and particularly against a large power, are significant. But I would argue that they are not only obligations, the failure to act is also equally or greater in its significance.
Yeah, and before I pass it to Bethany, it reminds me of that famous memo that was leaked during the Rwanda genocide, which went on from one US government department to another, saying, be careful, legal at state, trying to classify this as a genocide will obligate us to do something. So they go through all sorts of intellectual contour, exercises to try to make sure to obfuscate the situation, to make sure a determination is not made, because that simply means, by the, as you said, by the definition of the convention, that you have to actually do something about this. And when the political appetite is not there, then they'll try to muddy the waters. But I think your point is very important. I think there has to be made clear that there is nothing in the Genocide Convention that says, look, this body has to make a determination before any intervention can be taken. And the fact is, the purpose of the convention is to prevent and to stop and punish genocide. It is not to do an academic exercise as everybody does now, many years after the event. And the same thing we've seen with the Rohingya, as well as that, still debating many bodies, is this a genocide or not? And these academic exercises are simply contrary to what the convention is about. But let me pass it to Bethany, what Yonah asked in terms of access to the ground now, which is actually getting much more difficult. So obviously getting evidence and getting access to the region. We've seen the BBC journalists being expelled, Wall Street Journal, almost, I think a lot of international media have now been expelled from China. So how does that make your life more difficult, Bethany, and your work? How does that complicate that further?
Well, it's a really serious problem. And I myself am not allowed to go to China. My own visa was denied a couple of years ago. And what we've seen specifically with regards to the genocide in Xinjiang is in 2020, and I think it was Jean Bunyan at the Xinjiang Victims Database who said this, but he knows of 0 mass internment camp survivors who left China in all of 2020. And so much of what we know about what's happening in Xinjiang is coming from people who have been able to leave. And many of those people it's disproportionately Kazakhs rather than Uyghurs, because there is no Uyghuristan. This is the whole problem. Xinjiang would be Uyghuristan, right? So because Kazakhstan, there's an ethnic state or some kind of state that views itself as a home for Kazakhs. So some Chinese Kazakhs have been able, because of that connection and family connections and maybe, previous citizenships, to be able to get to Kazakhstan. And so a lot of reporters who have been reporting on Xinjiang go to Kazakhstan, not Xinjiang. But in 2020, 0 camp survivors were able to leave. And I think that this is a very specific goal. China has been getting better at, it's like playing whack-a-mole, they are playing whack-a-mole with researchers. After the China cables were published, with the ICIJ, ICIJ in 2019, and after right around the same time, the New York Times also published some leaked documents. There was an internal directive that was sent around in Xinjiang to government and party bureaus saying, burn all the papers, take away all access to computers, stop putting things on computers, stop collecting data so that it doesn't exist in the first place, to make it harder to leak this kind of stuff. We've still seen some leaks, but it's getting further and further apart. So it is getting much harder. And now after, there was the US-China relations took a real nosedive during the pandemic. And that was when so many US or reporters who work for US outlets were kicked out. The Washington Post says for the first time in maybe 30 years, they have more reporters based outside of China, covering China from outside of China than from inside of China. New York Times, I think, has a few people there, but not like they were before. Wall Street Journal's, most of their bureau has been already kicked out. Now the BBC, we've seen some Australian journalists. So it's getting harder and harder. And even for people who are still there, the trend that was already happening was that fewer and fewer people are willing to talk, even people who want to, because they're afraid. It's getting just, reporters who are based on the ground say, people won't return our calls, no one will talk to us. So we're in a really severe and in some ways unprecedented situation. It's, by no means is it like what we saw during the Cold War, where it was this iron curtain and you didn't know what was going on inside. But the difference is that China is, going to be the world's largest economy. It has learned how to weaponize that economic heft that it has, and it's highly integrated in with the rest of the world. It's highly integrated in with the Western system. And so, as my co-panelists have already said, we're really facing a point here, as people who live in liberal democracies or people who support, human rights conventions and support the post-World War II attempts to make the world a better place for everybody. We're at a point now where we're basically choosing between money and human rights. That's what China is doing. It's saying, you ignore all of our problems, you can have it, trade with us, we'll make you rich. And many, many, many people, business owners, entrepreneurs, multinationals, governments are choosing that direction. So, you know, that's our choice. And I have been very concerned at the way that, you know, that China has been able to erode this kind of human rights choice. I wanted to go a little back to our discussion of sort of the international situation and make a point about China's own decision making here. It is so, you know, some people tend to view the CCP as being, you know, smarter than we are, making better decisions than we are, thinking more long term than we are. Let me just like sort of push back against that to say that I think that the CCP chose to build mass internment camps for a religious and ethnic minority shows that they truly do not actually understand a lot of the nature of Western country and the Western experience in the 20th century. I think the CCP believes its own propaganda that you know, Western countries, all they want is to contain China, and we're not actually interested in human rights. And they don't understand the deep, profound trauma that World War II was to us, and our sense of guilt and responsibility for having let the Holocaust happen, and other things like that. And that's why I truly believe they did not understand that by putting a religious ethnic minority in camps, they were doing the bad thing. This is the bad thing that you cannot do. And the turn in DC against the CCP, against China, has been in large part because of that. And speaking personally, you know, my decision to change the nature of my reporting to focus on China's abuse of its power was in large part because of that. So that is just to say that they don't necessarily understand the institutions that they are trying to change, and they don't, I believe, understand the true and deep commitment that many governments, and I keep saying Western, but that's not what I mean. You know, there's any democratic government that many democratic governments have to human rights, and that our civil societies have to human rights, and that is a strength that we absolutely need to continue speaking to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, Bethany. I think that's something that Xi Jinpingism is actually perpetuates, is that, look, China has always been a great power and much more aggressive in terms of asserting itself on the global stage rather than trying to bind its time as previous leaders. And you know, there's only one period in history, this what they call the Century of Humiliation, which is essentially an anomaly, and China will once again take its position as a leading kind of civilization around the globe. And these Western countries are simply just trying to hold them back, and that's their only motivation behind this. But I actually wanted to follow on, Bethany. You know, there's obviously a lot of there's this belief, particularly in Washington, about China's sophisticated kind of internet and technological advantage, which is obviously very clear to most of us. But in terms of their propaganda efforts, there seems to be a huge gulf developing in terms of what they expect the effect for it to be and what the actual effect is. And we've seen this actually most recently, you know, when they've sanctioned members of parliament, you know, various academics and institutions and so on. And it's having precisely the kind of opposite effect. And I understand that much of it is for domestic audience. It's like, oh, look, we're standing up to these people, you know, the wolf warrior diplomacy. A lot of it is just purely for internal memos to trying to show people, Xi Jinping and people around him, how strong they are. But it seems that the whole effort does not seem to be very sophisticated in terms of actually trying to ameliorate their situation. And you know, why is that the case? Because even, you know, anybody, you know, many of these countries that engage in this kind of, you know, human rights abuses, they'll hire a PR firm on K Street here in Washington or somewhere else that kind of whitewashes a lot of their actions and a lot of their abuses. But China just does not seem to be very sophisticated in its whole approach. And is there a logic behind that, or is it something that they're still kind of trying to figure out themselves?
I think there's a couple things going on, and the most important one is because you know, Xi Jinping has created such a hardline environment, environment that's intolerant of many kinds of a multiplicity of opinions and internal, you know, dissenting discussions to a great degree. You increasingly get an echo chamber, right? And that's, I mean, isn't that what is intended, you know, for at least for an average domestic audience? You know, they can't, you know, they have a great firewall. They can't see this, they can't say that. So you get this big echo chamber, and that's an important part of what's going on. But also, and I would say this is maybe equally important, is that China's top leaders decided their basically assessment as of, you know, last year around this time, or maybe by the summer, was that the West is basically done. That the West is weak, America's done, America's in decline. China is is, on a swift upward momentum, and that no one can stop it. That really seems to be a major operating assumption of China's authorities. And so, by doing this, by just so blatantly pissing off a bunch of people at the same time, putting these doing economic coercion against Australia for having called for an independent investigation into the origins of the coronavirus, and the border dispute with India, and the wolf warrior diplomacy across Europe, and just the endless insults against India and Sri Lanka, and certainly the US, and kidnapping, holding as political hostages 2 Canadians. I think they're doing that because they feel like there's nothing that the West is going to do in return, or nothing significant. And it is my belief that they are making the mistake of underestimating America's resilience and the resilience of democratic countries around the world. We are going through a moment of democratic vulnerability, and our own confidence has been deeply shaken. And China could be right. They could be right. They could have taken a calculated risk, and they could win. They could successfully get away with this genocide and not face any consequences ever. That could be possible. They may be able to get what they want, but I think that's not by any means written in stone.
Yeah, it was interesting because if you look at the actual numbers after the coronavirus, China's this process has now been accelerated in terms of China's rise. The economy is expected now to overtake the United States as the biggest economy in the world by 2028. What difference will that make to people's lives? What difference will it make to my life or your life? Probably none whatsoever. None of us are going to actually know it. But the reality is the psychological effect of that on Western policymakers, on the West in general, is going to be profound. Now, some are saying that this process will be slowed down because of Biden's stimulus package. And the reality is that China they manufacture a lot of their economic numbers anyway, so can't really take it at face value. But I remember speaking to a US admiral who's a 3-star admiral, and he was telling me, and he's obviously got access to a bit better information than myself. He was telling me, look, we're trying to understand in terms of how China will behave when it passes the precipice of being the world's largest economy, and then subsequently after that, one of the largest military, if not the largest military power in the world. And he said that we anticipate China will just do what it wants. It wants Hong Kong, it will take Hong Kong. It wants Taiwan, it will take Taiwan. And it wants the South China Sea, it will just take it. And there'll be nobody there to stop it, because they'll have grown so much in confidence. And the whole world will simply just change. We'll have a completely different set of international norms, the rules-based order that we have tried to enforce throughout the globe since the Second World War, which obviously imperfectly is an imperfect system, but there still did exist, will simply become irrelevant in many respects, and we'll see a 2-tier kind of system in the world. We'll have the China camp, countries that are beholden to China, that part of the Chinese sphere of influence that are dependent on China and China's economic dependence. And then we'll have countries in the West that are essentially democracies. And now, obviously, as you said, we've got even hybrid systems. Democracy is under attack. And this is something that China is actually very, very interested and very favourable in terms of promoting. I will look at the West is in complete decline. Many of these riots, Black Lives Matters and other, got considerable coverage in China, simply trying to demonstrate that, well, look, this is the chaos that you can expect in a democratic system, and what you really need is a strong authoritarian leadership. So the world is going to change, I believe, beyond many expectations as China continues to rise. But I wanted to take it on to John. John, with our report in particular, we've had a lot of we've not had in terms of significant attacks against us. Individually, we've had lots of trolls, as you know. Many of our contributors have been contacted by Chinese lobby groups, Chinese embassies, etc.
Sanctioned even.
Yeah, we've not been sanctioned as yet. But many of our contributors have been contacted, they've been trolled, and some of these emails that they're receiving from Chinese embassies in their respective countries, some of them very badly written, very, very poorly written. But we ourselves have not really been attacked in any sort of capacity. But that does not mean that there's nothing coming down the pipeline. But I just wanted to get your thoughts in particular, John, in terms of standing up to China. Countries are not willing to do that. Individuals and corporations are not willing to do that simply because of the cost of doing so. But what would be the cost of, for inaction, particularly when a country is engaged in genocide? What would that actually mean for the Genocide Convention and international law itself?
Azim, let me put it in a bit of a context and pick up on the last part of the conversation. Because the last part of the conversation was essentially an observation and a speculation about kind of real politics in the current moment and going ahead. We don't know, but what we do know is that China even today is less than 20% of the global economy. I know it's rising, and the US is dropping down to not much more than 20%. The European Union is closer to 0.25%. We're seeing half of the world's scientists are actually in India. If we look at the production of things like AstraZeneca, vaccines and so forth, the vaccine production, and I could go on. So that's only really talking about kind of competition in international relations. I come back to international law. So there is something called the Charter of the United Nations. And for whatever the Chinese perspective about, their manifest destiny, if I can use that word, they're still bound by the UN Charter. And the Charter of the United Nations actually says whatever the CCP thinks, the duty of China and their obligation towards development in Article 1, the objects and purposes of the UN Charter is including to the fulfillment of the dignity and respect of human rights of everyone. And in Article 55 speaks about the well-being of everyone, including the right of self-determination of peoples. Now, China's in breach of this. They're clearly not doing that. So they're in breach of the basic semi-constitutional treaty of the world, which is the Charter of the United Nations. Now, what does that mean in terms of everyone else? China is now projecting this authoritarian, dictatorial approach. For example, sanctioning individual scholars for what they may say or think. I mean, that's really what's happening. And international law does not support that. Those are breaches. They're not international crimes, but those are breaches of international law. They're interferences with freedom of speech. They're interferences with academic freedom and so forth. They might be interferences with property where they might confiscate property and so forth. So a host, this is a slippery slope. I mean, this is really now a challenge. Is the world heading towards an authoritarian approach to governance globally? And we do know Freedom House is reporting on the consistent 15-year retreat of democracies, but I'm actually not so convinced about this. I don't think it's in China's interest, and I don't believe China has even thought through throwing out the UN Charter. China is entirely dependent on hydrocarbons, for example. The rising expectations, I congratulate China in doubling or even tripling in some respects the life expectancy of some parts of the population in basically 3 generations. That's remarkable progress. But is it a beacon of liberty in the world? No, it's not. And it's not likely to become. Its own interdependency in the world is substantial. So we have to come back to international law. We have to, as a basic normative framework of relations between states and peoples. And in this framework, there has to be an adherence to the essential respect of not only the jurisdictional authority of China, but China's respect of the jurisdictional authority of everyone else, and the respect of human rights. So I'm a little less pessimistic about this kind of competition. I actually think the world is deeply concerned, and of course the way to respond to this is collectively. There's not a single protector of global liberty. And I don't think we should necessarily aspire to that. But I do think it's really now a responsibility, a collective shared responsibility. And much can be done, including of relatively smaller states that have particularly important, for example, either natural resource contributions for China and so forth. These have to be addressed, but they're not going to be addressed as long as we deny what's going on. And that's the problem with the refusal to grasp the genocide, which is an ongoing genocide of the Uyghurs. That cannot be denied, because then there's really no limit.
And if I may add to that, Azim, or do we have time?
Yeah, go ahead, Yonah, you get the last word.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I just wanted to add to the whole point about recognizing the genocide, bringing it back, and to Bethany's comments about survivors that face risks, and to John's comment about the sanctions. So I would say that China, while it's been sloppy in terms of disinformation around the genocide, accusing other countries of genocide in their past and therefore justifying their own in some way, or blaming victims of rape for having character traits that are morally questionable. I mean, I don't know how that convinces anyone outside of China, but they have been effective in terms of intimidating and silencing Uyghurs abroad who might be willing to speak up but are threatened, and their families are threatened at home. And so, not to mention those who have leaked some of these documents, I imagine they face even worse risks. And there's been thousands of officials in Xinjiang who are punished for failing to carry out the crackdown sufficiently. And as Bethany noted, there haven't been recent firsthand testimonies, survivors making it out as of late. And so this all speaks to an urgency as to recognizing the genocide and making sure that the victims, the activists, and those who have taken the risks to leak these documents, their efforts haven't been in vain. So I hope, that this will be taken seriously and immediately, because, time is of the essence.
No, thanks so much for that, Yonah. And with that, we've run out of time. But I want to give my sincere thanks to everybody, Yonah, John, and Bethany. Your views and your opinions, your interpretation is always so valuable. And there's been an absolutely fantastic and fascinating conversation. Do follow, for the viewers, do follow us on Twitter, the Newlines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre. You look it up, and hopefully we'll see you all again very soon. Have a good rest of the day, wherever you are.
Thanks, Azim.